Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. This week I wanted to share some thoughts on why I think spirituality is so important, not just at the level of the individual, but kind of for the future of our species, really, not to sound too grandiose. But as those of you who listen regularly will know, when I'm talking about spirituality, I'm not talking about anything supernatural. I'm just talking about cultivating perspectives that are beyond the rational mind and beyond the sense of self that's associated with it. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I say that, probably best to go listen to some of the back episodes, because I won't unpack that too much here. But I think accessing these states that are beyond the self, these kind of mystical, unitive, transcendent states, I think they're not just good for personal growth, but also they are truly necessary for the flourishing of our species. And our lack of prioritizing this way of seeing the world is part of the problem that leads to all the suffering we see in the world. So why is it of benefit to have these kind of mystical experiences? Well, we see in the clinical literature now with psychedelics that these mystical experiences are powerfully therapeutic for a bunch of different issues, from addiction to depression, end-of-life anxiety. And I think the reason they're so powerful for a whole range of issues is because we are these complex systems, and we kind of function along principles of homeostasis and self-balancing and coming into a kind of balanced relationship with our environment. And for us as a species, with our big brains, we manage to we can really interfere with nature in a way that other animals can't, and that can lead to situations of alienation where you're interrupting these natural balancing processes of health. And we know that the body and the mind have this natural tendency towards health, which is another way of saying this kind of homeostatic dynamic. If you cut yourself, it seems to magically heal over. But that principle is really at the core of what it is to be a living thing. Living things are systems that manage to keep themselves organized, even when things happen like cuts and other externally caused damage to the system can still find its balance again. That is kind of the essence of what it is to be a living thing. And so these states, the rational mind, the ego, the thinking mind, that's a kind of symbolic system that's evolved to control and try to not only manipulate symbols within our own minds and control dynamics within our own body, but also the world beyond us, and kind of dominate nature. And so if you can just suspend that one part of what we are, you can tap into this way of being that's wordless, beyond the rational mind, and it allows you to be kind of open to these kind of health producing, balancing, homeostatic dynamics. So that can happen at the level of the individual, but understanding the individual as a network is one thing. But if you look at society, clearly that's a network, right? Like it's obvious there is no monolithic thing that is society. It's this web of connections between all of us. And the same principles apply. If you have rigid control, you're going to have states of kind of neurotic suffering. You're not going to be allowing the system to find its own balance in this kind of bottom-up way, where the system can self-regulate. Instead, you're trying to kind of delineate rules and box everything in a way that the system isn't designed for that. Again, I say designed. It doesn't function along those principles. And that's just how complex systems are, these kind of complex networked systems. So when it comes to kind of politics and our kind of social situation, I see it as not as, what I should say is when it comes to our social situation, I don't see the issue as politics, as in trying to control and come up with better ideologies, because that's just another way of controlling, coming up with narratives where we can get everyone to align with us. All of these are just ways to kind of try to get a handle on everything. I think what we need is the opposite, is to learn to feel safe enough in the world and safe enough with each other that we can let go more and more and allow natural processes of health to arise. And that's not an easy task, but that's partly why I'm an advocate for psychedelic therapy, because I think politically, or again, maybe I should divorce these words, socially, I think healing collective trauma, healing individual trauma that makes up that collective trauma, is the best thing we can do to produce a better situation socially on a global level. It won't be the only thing we have to do, and as I said, it will be a big, it's a huge task. But I genuinely think that's the key to it. So I guess I see our social issues as kind of health issues. I think we have an unhealthy society globally at the moment, and the kind of diagnosis is at the core of that is this alienation from nature, the trauma and stress that comes with that pushes us into the rational mind, that's to do with kind of coping and forward looking and coming up with technological fixes, as opposed to the other way of being, which is beyond the rational mind, which is to rest in awareness in the present and face whatever comes up, face whatever the fears are, and allow. So I'm arguing we need to move into that mode. And I think psychedelic therapy and addressing trauma is the only thing powerful enough to really allow us to do that. Because if the traumas are too big, you're just going to keep running into wanting to come up with the next solution, whether it's an ideology or a technological fix or whatever. So this is kind of at the core of why I think spirituality is necessary for the human race. Remembering that when I say spirituality, I'm talking about cultivating these states beyond the rational mind. And I think it will also, it dissolves the desire to control others, in the kind of inequalities we see in society, because that comes out of fear. If you can trust others to mutually support each other, and mutually support you, then you don't need to kind of engage in these systems of control. So if we kind of rewind and think about what is it that makes us so different to other animals? Why are we in this mess and other animals aren't? Well, we have this very widespread idea of kind of anthropocentrism, where we really think that humans are the be-all and end-all. You see this in science, especially issues of consciousness, where many scientists are unwilling to entertain the idea that much of nature is conscious. As many of you will know, in my perspective, all of nature is conscious, all living systems. And I think we have a real psychological block that stops us from wanting to see ourselves as part of this, as part of nature, because it's tied up with these spiritual states. It's kind of too overwhelming for the ego to really recognize its humbled kind of place in this web as just one component in nature, rather than as the image we have of ourselves as kind of more important or more significant, or higher in some sense. You still see this language when people talk about consciousness as kind of human consciousness being some kind of pinnacle, which is not at all how I think about it. So we have this anthropocentrism that seems to go back a very long way, where, so 5,000 years ago you have Stonehenge and the pyramids in Egypt being built, and then 7,000 years before that, so as ancient for them as they are for us, you have Göbekli Tepe, this temple being built in Turkey, which in the 90s kind of rewrote our understanding of human history, where you see people kind of before the advent of settled kind of agricultural life building these temples that were not lived in, that would seem to be kind of serving some religious purpose. And these pillars that make up the temple, they have this kind of T shape. And Klaus Schmidt, the archaeologist who found, it was a local who found it, but the archaeologist who ran the project, he describes how some of these pillars are shaped like humans, and on the pillars are these kind of carved animals. And he kind of makes the point that this seems to be, he interprets this as saying that this split where we see ourselves as more important or higher than other animals was there even 12,000 years ago at the first evidence we have of any kind of megalithic structure being built. So it seems that there's something quite old in humans. I mean, that's still only a fraction of human history, but it seems that once we start to kind of get together and into large enough groups that we can start to build these huge structures, we are already getting into this mindset that we're really what's important. It's not about being a component in the web of nature. It's more about us being more significant. So for other animals, they don't presumably have this feeling that they're more important than the rest of nature. To a mouse, it probably seems very obvious that they are not above anything else, that they're just one piece in this web of nature. I'm not saying that they're sitting and thinking about it to us, but it's clear that they have prey and there are predators for which they are prey, and there's clearly no feeling of being truly separate from the rest of this kind of dynamic of nature. But for us there is, and when we have these kinds of ego transcending states, often it's synonymous with feeling part of nature, feeling like we're seeing the world the way a plant might see the world, and feeling a kind of kinship with the rest of nature. And I think this is one of the reasons I think this is so important is not just for the kind of the principles that can be understood with the rational mind that I was talking about earlier, about kind of complexity and self-organizing systems, and why it's wise to try and unlock that, or at least move into a mode where we're not interfering with that process, which is what the rational mind is doing. But the fact that it also seems relevant because we see this kind of at the core of so many different religious and spiritual traditions, these kinds of expanded states of awareness of moving beyond the self. And also they feel so good that it kind of, you can see that almost as a clue that there's something, that our biology might be telling us that there's something of value there. So this is something that I've been reflecting on since I Didn't Ask Me Anything, maybe a month ago now, where someone asked a question asking why the non-dual state, this state of kind of moving beyond the self, why it feels blissful. And I gave an answer kind of based in experience, like an experiential answer, where I was saying, from the perspective of the rational mind, it seems too good to be true. But from the perspective of just awake awareness, which is kind of what you're in when you're in that state, it feels like it just knows that this is like, well, what else would I feel like? This is what it feels like to not be suffering. So you might feel like, from the perspective of the separate self, you might think, well, surely it's just like void and emptiness. But it feels like it makes sense from this kind of very positive felt state of moving beyond the rational mind. But then since then, I've been reflecting on a more kind of scientific, I guess, explanation of that, which is that, so in the living mirror theory, you have consciousness being brought into existence through the kind of self-organizing dynamics of living systems, and that accounts for why you have felt states like pleasure and pain. This is going to be at the very core of what consciousness is. You're feeling out your way in the world, and being burnt by fire doesn't feel good, and that's to do with the kind of conscious experience of attributing a negative effect to your self-organization from the act of moving towards that fire. So you feel like it's bad to move towards that fire, whereas it feels good to eat food, for example. So it occurred to me that because I'm saying that these non-dual states of beyond the self are health promoting, it could be that that's why they feel good. That there's a kind of, in the same way that it feels good to eat because that's good for us, as captured by the living mirror theory, that it's good for our self-organization, and that's what generates consciousness, that dynamic. Then it could be the same thing where this was far more common before our kind of alienated modern life, that people would find themselves in these states and it would feel good because they're tapping into a process that's the core of kind of health inducing, both mentally but also physically, because of kind of mind-body connection. And this is a very kind of embodied picture of how the mind arises in the living mirror theory. So that could be one reason that that it feels very positive, that it's telling us that this is good for us, and it could also be telling us that it's good. It could be kind of selected for in a way where it's telling us it's good for the population as well as for the individual. And it's like you have the rational mind evolving as this kind of fear mechanism that keeps us safe and is concerned with closing off our boundaries and keeping us going in a state of self-organization. But then you have, to balance that, you have this tendency to want to move towards openness, because the non-dual state is one of complete openness, where you're not concerned with differentiating yourself from the environment. There's just this perceptual, full vulnerability, full openness to the world that feels good when fear feels bad. And so there's this polarity of like these two mechanisms kind of keeping us safe and healthy. So that's another reason why I think that our own experience of these states could be telling us how important they are. So the picture I've been kind of laying out here that kind of brings together ecology, like a view of us as being part of the natural world, with spirituality and these states of ego transcendence, with political or social organization. The closest thing to this in the kind of academic literature is something called deepecology, which was founded by a Norwegian philosopher called Arne Naess, and he was kind of differentiating it from kind of shallow ecology, which would just be kind of like, I do my recycling and I take care of, I'm interested in the environment, but you still feel separate. Whereas deep ecology is this thing where you see humans as not apart from nature, as truly in the dynamics of nature. And it embraces these kind of spiritual states in the same way that I've spoken about here, and has similar influences to my influences like Buddhism, Taoism, and the wisdom of going with the kind of flow of nature, being open to it rather than having this top-down control. Now, the kind of school of thought of deep ecology includes a lot of different perspectives, and some of them can become quite extremist in the worst way, you could say. So this is why I didn't open with I'm just fully aligned with this perspective. So this is a good way to explore some of the dangers of or where you can go wrong on this terrain when you're thinking about human existence on this kind of deep level, rather than just on the level of kind of modern social organization. So what it can lead to is a biocentric ethics, where you're so interested in these states of transcendence, transcending the sense of self, transcending your sense of humanity, so that you identify with the fact of nature, that you basically say, well, what's really important is nature. Nature is inherently of value, and you are nature. So when you feel like your interests are important, really what's happening is you're recognizing that nature is important because you are nature, and you shouldn't emphasize the thing that makes you feel different as a human. So you get this biocentric ethics where everything is as important as everything else, and that can lead to this odd school of thought called ecofascism, where you have people kind of going down this train of thought and ending up with situations where, so take something like the coronavirus. An extremist in this tradition of kind of deep ecology, or like moving into kind of ecofascism, would say something like, humans are just a blight on the earth. Humans are the worst. It has this kind of anti-humanist flavor. We just destroy nature and we're the problem. So something like the virus should just be allowed to rampage through the population. It's part of the natural homeostasis. Like we've got out of control through our strange alienated practices of intensive farming in small spaces. Like clockwork, this virus arises, and its job is to decimate the population to bring us back into some balance where we can actually, the earth can sustain us. And you can understand the logic of that. If you suspend your human kind of emotional reactions to it, you can follow the logic and say, if you were just dealing with an abstract system, you could understand, okay, like it's coming into some homeostatic balance through this process. Now, the problem there, which is, I feel is worth saying, even though it's kind of so obvious, is the best way I could say it is, this thing I often talk about, the doctrine of two truths, where you have the relative and the absolute, and they're both true. So in that perspective, you're trying to move past your sense of self, your sense of being a human, and you're trying to get into a state of kind of self-annihilation where you fully negate yourself. And you're trying to live in the absolute perspective that really what's going on is nature. And it's all about nature. It's not about humans. It's just about nature. But in this network of nature, you are a human. Like, that is true. Like, your relative stance, even though on the absolute level you are nature, on the relative level, you're a human. And that's true as well. It's not true, it's true in a relative sense rather than an absolute sense. So the healthy perspective is to hold both of those truths at the same time. There's a great lecture by Ram Dass called Nowhere to Stand that you can find on YouTube. I'll put a link in the description, that I love, where he basically talks about this. He talks about viewing the world from a very kind of detached, kind of God's eye view of just seeing everything as this kind of perfect unfolding, where you would see deaths in the pandemic as just like, well, it's just like dominoes falling. It's just the dance of being in this complete non-attached, ego-transcended way. And then he says, but then you have the other perspective from your kind of human heart where you're saying like, this is awful. And he says they're both true and there's nowhere to stand. You can't just stand in the human perspective where you're willing to sacrifice everything for the anthropocentric kind of idea of humans being the most important. Or at least you can do that, but it's not wise. And you can't just live in the absolute and trying to pretend you're not a human. You need to engage in this dance of, this is our situation. We have to hold both of these things. So I was saying, it seems so obvious that, when you're dealing with these issues, if someone suggests that it implies something that you have a kind of a felt reaction to, that it seems abhorrent, it probably is, and that's probably not a good thing for us to do. And it's not hypocritical. You're holding these, this is when you get into, sometimes people talk about paradox and stuff and spiritual stuff, but you're seeing the situation so clearly that it synthesizes everything. You can hold both the absolute and the relative at the same time. And like in Taoism, it becomes a kind of a skillful dance to figure out when is the right time to move in the direction of the absolute and kind of move beyond the self, and when's the right time to actually be more self-assertive and more concerned with humanity. So that's my take on why I think the deep ecological perspective is really the antidote to the problems of the world. And that sounds very big, but I really see this as the root. And if you follow out the implications, you not only address climate change, but social inequality, individual mental health, collective mental health. It all comes out of this kind of seeing the wisdom of allowing this kind of bottom-up, helpful way of being. But you don't need to fall into the extremist traps of saying, that's the only perspective I'm going to look from. You can still, it's not like the anthropocentrism, we're way over on that side right at the moment. And it's not that we need to go way over onto the other side. We need to find a healthy dance between the two. Now, with the anthropocentrism, where we're currently at, to bring this back to the idea of the rational mind and moving beyond it, we have this kind of tradition of rationalism. People are not, as far as I can see in the public space, people are not having this conversation about what needs to be, in the mainstream, people are not talking about the limits of rationality when it comes to our social health. And it's understandable because it triggers fear. With all the collective trauma, if you suggest giving people more freedom, allowing them to organize locally and take life into their own hands, to do that, you need to turn around the ship and have a culture that's willing to own its own fear. And we see that we're so far from that with psychedelics being illegal. We just don't live in a culture that's interested in doing shadow work, you could say, to use kind of Jungian language. But that's the cultural change we need. And I do hope that the more people find psychedelics as a tool for this kind of healing, people will come to this perspective. And again, it's not an ideology. I'm trying to articulate what I see as obvious truths that I've seen many other people. I've seen many other people have the same realizations, see the world the same way. So I'm trying to speak from that place of how one can see the world in a way that might be helpful, rather than saying, here are the rules, here are the principles that you have to agree with. So I think that it's also part of a bottom up. The more of us can just have these discussions and try and clarify what's the best way to think about this stuff in a non-ideological way, the better, I think. So at the moment, though, we have this situation of kind of hyper-rationalism, which goes back a few hundred years. It's very recent, right? That, since kind of Spinoza and the Enlightenment, you have this emphasis on rationalism that, again, is incredibly biased to one extreme. So it's not when you're aligning with rationalism, if you're a pure rationalist, that is kind of, that cultural movement is kind of, it's like cultural sociopathy. It's like the eco-fascist thing where you're, presumably through some personal trauma, you've decided to split off from emotion because it feels too intense and too big. And so you say, I'm just going to think things through with my kind of linguistic symbols. And I need evidence that can be articulated. And that's the same as living in a mode where if someone comes to you in excruciating pain, if you're detached from your basic capacity to have compassion for them and go, oh my God, they seem to be in pain, and then use your rational mind to try to figure out what to do about it, if instead you're completely cut off from your emotions and you say, well, show me your pain, that's a kind of a deranged person. And I think there's we have the same derangement happening at this cultural level where I don't think it's coincidence that science emerged out of the same culture that colonialism emerged out of. You have these countries that were rampaging around the world and enslaving people, which is something that requires a suspension of basic empathy, basic compassion. And they're the same people who are creating these kind of gigantic kind of edifices, intellectual edifices, which are very impressive. I'm a scientist. I think there's a huge amount of good that's come out of science. But science and rational thinking should always be in the service of a healthy emotional perspective, which is beyond the rational mind. If we have good emotional health, then we can use science and rationality in the service of our well-being and in the service of collective flourishing. Whereas at the moment, we don't do that. We kind of use it for its own sake, and it can become kind of twisted and cause harm. And, we see this with kind of, military technology, and just, since its inception, it's been aligned with forces of domination and not with forces of kind of love and compassion and allowing freedom for others and mutual flourishing. And so we see this today. There's, a lot of people who are unwilling or unable, I should say, who have kind of been split off from their emotions in a way where they can't tap into they can't use the rationality in service of the compassion. So, someone who seems to be quite popular amongst my listenership is Sam Harris, who's also a neuroscientist who also talks about kind of meditation and psychedelics. But I see his core problem as being the epitome of the problem, really, as someone who seems to be far more aligned with the rationality side of things, but sees the wisdom of spirituality and then imports a stripped down version of spirituality that's all about the individual and the individual's kind of psychology of suffering that can be transcended, and has nothing to say about these deeper principles. And worse than that, because the rationality comes first, it has that sociopathic flavor where you take something like systemic racism, instead of recognizing it on an intuitive level for the horror show that it is, there's this kind of, well, show me the evidence. Is it really, in following the George Floyd killing last year, there was, I believe his statement was that basically the Black Lives Matter movement is completely wrong. There is no issue of the murder of black people in America by the police. The statistics suggest, he's arguing the statistics don't show it. And this way of thinking has its own kind of internal consistency, because you're just setting aside compassion and those parts of the mind that allow you to perceive in different ways, that are beyond just saying, well, show me the evidence. And so you get this kind of, it has this internal consistency where you can't really engage with it. You can't, once you cross that threshold to start to engage with it, you're on those terms, and you can't, it's kind of, I find it kind of unsettling to talk to people like that who you just see they just don't get it, and you can't, there's nothing you can say to be like, can you just get it on this intuitive level, because they can't. And so you see, I think this is why you see a lot of, it's a shame that there's a real disconnect between, as someone who talks about science and spirituality, I find it sad that there's this is part of the problem between the science sphere and the spirituality sphere, because the spiritual people by and large are cultivating these ways of knowing that are beyond the rational mind, and scientists, a lot of them are people who have been pushed into that mode because they don't do well in the feeling side of things, so they find it deeply enjoyable to play around with concepts. So there's this strand of kind of sociopathy and narcissism that splits off the emotional side that you find with extreme rationalism. And what we need is, as I said, is rationality and science in the service of compassion, and seeing the importance of felt states as primary, rather than kind of engaging in this sociopathic endeavor of this heritage that comes from colonialism of using evidence and rationality first as a way to deny and gaslight people's experience. And so, when it comes to rationality in the 20th century, saying very few people are talking about, as far as I can see, moving beyond rationality when it comes to social organization. And I really think all 20th century political systems seem to have kind of fetishized rationality. You clearly see it in the dominant system of, as I mentioned, the kind of scientific current situation we have with parliamentary politics. It's all about kind of debate and discourse. And so again, we're talking about kind of conflict and power rather than health. And so in the extreme of that, in the kind of extreme kind of right-wing ideologies, I was listening to an audiobook the other day which mentioned Ayn Rand, the kind of far-right libertarian kind of thinker, and I use thinker in quotes there, and she they were saying how in this hyper rational system, if you have a child that you don't want, well then you just sell them on the free market to someone who does want them, and that's the solution to having a child you don't want. And again, if you were like a robot, that might make sense to you to say, okay, yeah, that person doesn't want them, that person does want them, move them over there, the market will let that happen. But again, I probably shouldn't have to tell you that there's a kind of a basic kind of horror response at that, because we recognize, again, if you don't see the problem with that, then you're probably in the camp that I'm criticizing here, who split off from the emotion side of things. But it doesn't take much to see that would be a horror show for the child, that is not a healthy way, that is a traumatic experience to me to be sold to someone. For feeling creatures like ourselves to be caught up in systems of abstract control is traumatizing. So that's another case where you've got too much rationality. But you see the same thing in the 20th century with kind of Marxist-Leninist state communism, where you have this kind of policy of state atheism and this prioritizing of rationality and the kind of human will to make things a certain way, and that's the epitome of the kind of control that I'm criticizing here. And something that's more aligned with what I'm talking about here is kind of Mahayana Buddhism, which is also called the Bodhisattva path, because it's about trying to become as kind of enlightened as you can so that you can help others in the world. And so it's this kind of socially engaged strand of Buddhism. And there's a very inspiring figure, Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese monk who's been a kind of peace activist since the 60s. His worldview seems to be very aligned with what I'm describing here as a kind of Buddhist peace activist. But he is from Vietnam and was kind of exiled after his peace activism because of it's still a communist state. And there's a lot of suppression of these kinds of traditions. So whether you go far right or far left, for the most part, you've got this kind of fetishization of rationalism and thinking that the human ability to think and control is where solutions need to come from. And I'm arguing the opposite. And so the deep ecology stuff, if you want to position this on a political compass, it's kind of going to be the kind of left libertarian in the sense of like anarchist freedom and equality side of things, rather than the kind of totalitarian side of things that are described with the state communism. So, but with this perspective, it's understandable that you have an ideology that says religion is dangerous. Religion is, a system of domination. We see that, in many places where any kind of hierarchical institution becomes a system of domination. And, to me, it seems the kind of insane hypocrisy of the Christian church, especially the Catholic Church, that you have the teachings of Jesus, who is very much aligned, as far as I can see, with these kinds of principles I'm talking about here. There's a tradition of Christian anarchism and kind of Christian fellowship that it really resonates with this as well. And that the institutionalized power of the church is the complete antithesis of those teachings. But so you do have problems with the institutionalized religion, but it's the power, it's the institutionalization, the domination that's the problem, not the spiritual component of it. But then on the other side, without religion, the basic if you don't have this kind of naturalistic spirituality where you're subsumed, you see yourself as part of nature, then you're seeing the kind of egoic rational mind as it just kind of has free reign. It's the most important thing. You get into kind of Nietzschean God is dead type situations of just thinking, well, it's just us humans here, so we better just go around the world and do whatever we want. And obviously I'm arguing that's not the wise way to be. So I think we need a kind of decentralized spirituality of where we do have skepticism of kind of institutionalized power and gurus. And skepticism, again, comes from rational mind. So this is a synthesis. I'm not just critiquing the rational mind. I think you need, and I describe this as a naturalistic spirituality. So I think we need a spirituality that's not supernatural, that's reined in by science and rationality, but again, in the service of compassion and wanting flourishing for all of us, rather than for its own sake, and for the kind of associated dynamics of power that go along with it, with pure rationality. And so this split, I think needs to be healed. Where you see pure rationality, I suspect there's usually a trauma that's caused someone to shut off from their emotions because their emotions are too powerful, or have been in those traumatic states. And so we need something like psychedelic therapy to undo those traumas and let people get back in touch with their feelings so that they can navigate the world through wordless felt states that are beyond the rational mind, rather than just being stuck in the rational mind. Because when we do that, we become obsessed with these kinds of top-down technological fixes for things, and we just get pushed down this path of more and more stress, more and more trauma, because we're not coming into this balance through moving beyond the rational mind. And so you have this split there between rationality and emotion, but you can have it on the other side as well, where an associated idea from what I've been talking about is primitivism, or anarcho-primitivism, which is a kind of critique of our situation, much like I've been saying, where if you take the perspective of what a healthy homeostatic natural system looks like, and then you look at us from that perspective, it becomes very clear what's wrong with us. Now, I think that's a powerful critique of our situation, but I don't think it offers directly solutions. I don't think the solution, if we went back to being hunter-gatherers who were kind of balanced with nature, the earth would not, it doesn't have enough carrying capacity for us to do that, to be hunter-gatherers anymore. And so you get back into ecofascism there, where if you fully align with that view and you let go of if you have the split from your emotions, you have people who just say, well, that's what needs to happen. We just need to let, the majority of humans die. And again, that's why you need to have the basic, as if I have to say this, you need to have the basic human emotion component to say, that's not a good idea. We may not be able to implement the perfect solution. Well, again, we're not talking about implementing solutions here. We're talking about moving in the direction of more and more freedom, more and more health. And it's just always going to be a balancing act. We humans are this strange, alienated species. That is our situation. We can't pretend that we're chimpanzees and kind of try and live that way. We're always going to have tools, even though tools are a kind of extension of this mode of domination of nature. This is why I think, having this perspective and then tool making in a way where we're kind of inspired by ecological principles, and we have kind of nature inspired design that's in the service of collective well-being. I can see a situation where we could have a future where we can still have all of our quirks as a human species, but we just keep an eye on them. We have an awareness of them, and we know how they can run away with us and lead us into this unconscious fear-driven mode of growth and technological fixes that we currently are now in. So, I mean, as a bit of hard evidence for the fact that this kind of derangement can happen, you have Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who was a kind of primitivist, although probably more on the eco-fascist side. And he, someone who terrorized the population at large in America because he wanted to see the downfall of technological society. And he thought a kind of violent insurrection was what needed to happen. And it doesn't, if you're someone who's putting bombs on planes where there are kids, again, you don't need me to tell you that that's someone who's been emotionally deranged, and that the solution to that is probably to address the emotional derangement. And the more we do that at a societal level, the less likely you're going to have people who can get so into their ideology that they're capable of kind of being mass murderers and serial killers in that way. It's funny to be talking about what I see as a perspective of peace and flourishing and collective well-being, and for there to be elements closely associated with that go off in these directions. I think it's because modern society can be so wounding, can be so damaging, that you can get people who are deranged, taking interest in this perspective. And I mean, Kaczynski was, by all accounts, a genius. He was a professor of mathematics at Berkeley. He was maybe one of the youngest there. So his rational mind was working, and he wrote manifestos that academics still kind of cite it as in this kind of canon of literature. So you really can get this split between the rational mind and kind of basic compassion and felt states in a healthy way. So I think, it comes down to having this balancing of these two perspectives, seeing ourselves as nature. We all need to know that that's true and feel that to be true, and then exploring the middle ground where we don't deny our humanity. I think this is a mistake you see a lot in spirituality as well, is thinking the aim is to fully transcend yourself and be enlightened. And I see that as kind of spiritual bypassing. I don't think we should be seeking enlightenment. I think we should be seeking the recognition of our situation and then trying to live it in the most healthy way possible. And collectively addressing our emotional health, so that fear doesn't keep hijacking us to go down the technological fix route. Because if one's not in touch with one's fear, the things I've spoken about here, as soon as you're in the vicinity of people talking about these horrific ideas of kind of allowing huge parts of the human population to die, it's very understandable to have a fear response and go, screw that, I don't want to go anywhere near those ways of thinking. The good thing for me is this comes from my own experience, my own thinking, and then looking into the literature and then being shocked that there are people who have similar views that can go off in such a strange tangent. So I don't think these views are inherently lend themselves to that. And as I've said here, I think it goes without saying really that you just need to be in touch with your basic human feelings and to know they're not, that they are valid, to avoid the kind of the strange avenues one can go down here. And I think as I said at the start, psychedelic therapy, coming up with a culture that really values healing trauma through accessing these states is the best way we can get towards this kind of, we can increase these this way of being in the world where we'll be more free, more healthy, and less aligned with systems of control. Yeah, thanks for listening.